Hi guys, as we talked about before, and I also let you know in my email, here's a quick summary of the lecture on modernization. You already have a handout, the handout that you see in front of you on the screen, which starts with what is civilization and continues on to the contributory factors in Europe for modernization from 1 through 7, Roman numeral 7. Let's just focus on the 5 major factors contributing to modernization in Europe. And for those of you who've had History 105, this is nothing other than a quick recap of the major factors behind the modernization in Europe, which would be the Renaissance, the Reformation, new monarchy, new economy, or the rise of capitalism, and explorations, particularly those initiated by the Portuguese and Spanish in the beginning, thereafter continued by the Dutch, French, and English in subsequent centuries. Now, even though it is going to be a recap of some of the information from 105, for those of you who've had the first half of Western Serve, and even though this is technically the situation that was taking place in 15th, 16th century Europe, what we're going to be looking at would be more a worldwide implication of these factors. And so for the continent of Asia, it's going to have a pretty long-standing effect, as also for other parts of the world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, will be integrated into the history of Europe with the beginning of this period of modernization. Now, we've agreed to disagree about a lot of these terms. Our definition probably needs to be refined over the next few weeks as we go along. And one of these words that we bandied about and agreed to disagree on was modernization itself. But let's assume that given all those various interpretations of modernization, we have included some of the characteristics of modernization that have been listed in number 6, such as control over the environment, to a certain extent, of course, increased per capita income, activation of the masses, vision towards the future and progress, more of a secular approach. And I'm not going to say religion doesn't play a part at all, but not quite the path that is dictated by the church in the continent of Europe prior to this, and a faith in the contributions of science and technology. So let's start with the first of these factors. We've had a chance to go over some of these in our class discussion. We'll come back to the joint impact of all these factors, which would be Roman numeral 8. But let's go through a discussion of 9, which is an analysis of the Renaissance, both the Italian as well as the Northern, in really the context of not just European history, but world history. Now, the term Renaissance, obviously, it's a French word. It's renaître, or to be reborn, rebirth. And rebirth obviously suggests that there is a prior birth that we are referring to, and this is nothing other than the classical civilization of Rome and Greece. Now, the Renaissance in the 14th, 15th centuries would be more than just a rebirth, more than just a revival of the classical forms of art and literature, architecture, and other developments that you're more familiar with. It'll also be further innovation and more advanced approaches towards all these subfields of art, architecture, and literature, and what have you. Now, where did it all begin? Well, of course, the Italian peninsula. Remember, there is no country of Italy. It does not emerge until the late 19th century. So we will, if we remember, continue to refer to the Italian peninsula as just that, the Italian peninsula, rather than refer to it as a country. The center of the Italian Renaissance was Florence, Firenze, but there were other city-states which sponsored similar developments, and those were Rome and Milan and Napoli or Naples and Venice and Genoa. All of these city-states had a flourishing economy, and it's mainly the merchant class which is responsible for the sponsorship of artists and literateurs, dramatists, playwrights, poets, to contribute towards the Italian Renaissance. So it's a purely urban setting, quite unlike the pre-Renaissance period when most of the artistic accomplishments, most of the literary advancements are through the sponsorship of kings and queens. It's not the aristocracy that was really created in the midst of an agrarian economy that's at the lead. It's a merchant-based economy and an urban setting, and so quite a different class that's taking the role of leadership in both political and cultural accomplishments. And unlike the old liaison, the alliance between the church and the state, the aristocracy and the priesthood, we've got more of an independent development that's occurring in the urban areas with this new elite, the merchant elite. And so their promotion and sponsorship and support is towards a literature and art, a view of life that is not overwhelmed by religion, not restricted by religion. And so it's more of a secular approach. There's also an emphasis on individualism. An individual recognizes the potential, I'm going to say he instead of he or she has, because it's mainly the he who will realize his full potential. So an individual is not bound by his station in life. And what I mean by that is, in the old agrarian economy, there was a place for the aristocrat, and was at the very top of society. For the rest of the population, the peasantry, there really wasn't much of an option to climb up the social ladder unless they were able to set aside a little bit of money and move to the urban area, and if they were really fortunate to be so successful in their trade that they would occupy these positions of prominence in the urban areas and eventually sponsor a new movement. Now, those were just a handful of families, but by and large, the social mobility that you see is more of an urban development, and we're looking at peasants who are technically getting the freedom to experience the lifestyle, if not of the rich and the famous, but at least of the well-off. And so from amongst these peasants, there will be climbers of the social ladder who will get into trade or will rise because of their handicrafts, develop some special skills, and or, if they're lucky, get access to education. And these are the people who will then become the individuals will realize that just as their station is not determined, station in society, their place in society is not determined by birth, so also the horizon in terms of acquiring knowledge is limitless. And even though all people are not going to be able to take advantage of the situation, theoretically it is possible. And that realization itself will open many doors. And they will explore new horizons, literally and figuratively, as they explode out of the European continent and go across thousands of miles to the New World, to Africa, to Asia. Now, in the midst of all of these accomplishments, there is also this notion that we have to keep in the back of our mind. Remember, we said there is no Italy but the Italian peninsula. So it's the city-states who are sponsoring the movement of the Renaissance. The city-states are rich, they are flourishing centers, but they're also competitors. So Genoa would compete with Milan, and Milan with Rome, and Rome with Florence, and Florence with Naples. And in this competitive world, the spirit of an Italian nation, a nationalism that is going to supersede such competition, well, that's going to be hard to find. So one of the reasons why the Renaissance from the Italian peninsula will shift northwards and northwest in a northwesterly direction would be because neighboring France looked at this wealth, looked at the possibility of expansion next door. If you look at the map, there are plenty of contiguous territories, and France's expansion towards the east would have led to an invasion of the Italian peninsula. And in the late 1400s, so the 15th century, the Italian peninsula could not muster up enough of a national spirit to put up a national resistance against the French invasion. The Italian merchants have been the proverbial middlemen. It is through them that goods traveled from east of the Black Sea to the northwest of Europe. It went from as far as Spain, in the southwest to Russia, the western part of Russia, and northern Europe traded with the Middle East through the Italian merchants as middlemen. And so with the invasion of France, that disrupts this volume of trade, the Italian middlemen become less of a crucial factor in terms of the exchange of goods, and they are going to be supplanted or replaced by others who have speedier means of transportation and who are not encumbered by a foreign invasion, such as Portugal and Spain. We'll come to that in a minute. As artists and intellectuals feel the pressure of a foreign invasion, and it's a little difficult proposition to carry on these cultural accomplishments in the midst of an invasion, they travel north and west. And so the ideas of the Italian Renaissance are dispersed through what you would recognize as France of the future, German states, both what you'd recognize in the future as Western and Eastern Germany, the Netherlands, which would include Belgium and Holland, and the British Isles. And so the movement, when it spreads north, there is a blending of the focus on religion as well as secular ideas, and the spread of ideas with the importance that's given on the individual. combines in this new notion that religious ideas too can be discussed by individual intellectuals. They are not necessarily just the realm of the church. And so much debate ensues about the role of the church, about how the Bible is interpreted, whether the Catholic world in Western Europe is going to remain a monolithic structure. And from the Northern Renaissance, you're going to find the beginnings of what you would consider to be the Reformation of the future. So paintings and writings will have both secular as well as religious overtones, and then not just in Latin. Now, Latin and Greek were the language of the cultured, as it were, in classical civilization. And so those were the languages in which the classics were revived. They were rewritten and reinterpreted. But now we're going to see more of a focus on vernacular languages. And that's because when an individual realizes that he can truly achieve his own potential, irrespective of his birth, there's also this notion that this individual need not be restricted by the languages of the elite. And the language of the elite at that particular time would have been Latin. And so now we see a kind of a linguistic patriotism developing out of the notion of we who speak the English language are different from they who speak the French, and they who speak the French have different characteristics and a different history than those who speak Spanish. And so with language and with the notion of cultural uniqueness will come the future birth of nation states. But right now we'll see the writings of Shakespeare getting prominence when new characters are developed, and they don't all come from aristocratic backgrounds. We're going to see a focus on the writings of Montaigne, a French author, on not just France, but also countries and cultures that France comes into contact with. Cervantes, who you probably will recognize from your familiarity with Don Quixote, fighting of the windmills, the adventures of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. These are writings in Spanish and will necessarily involve elements of Spanish culture and Spanish values, of Spanish historical experiences. And so the Renaissance becomes much more than just a revival of the classics. It's now a prelude to the future birth of nation states. People like Rabelais, also French author, writing in French, in the French language. One of the major works was about Gargantua, the giant, from where you get the adjectival form gargantuan, huge, large, gargantuan proportions, gargantuan size. Brings us to the last point under the Renaissance, Northern Renaissance subcategory, which is the expansion of horizons. And we've referred to how individuals realize that there's nothing restricting them from acquiring knowledge, nothing restricting them from actually going across continents and experiencing new worlds. So there is intellectually and theoretically really no limit to what they can acquire. And a Renaissance personality or a Renaissance mindset is probably what I would want you to focus on, more than individual Renaissance artists and very specific paintings or monuments and statues and architectural buildings. That brings us to Roman numeral 10, which is an analysis of the Reformation. And again, for those of you who've done the first half of Western Civ or just in general are familiar with the Reformation, this is probably going to be repeat information, but bear with us as we go through this outline. Meaning of the term comes from the word reform, but in terms of what it implied, both for Europe and the rest of the world, the change was phenomenal and the implication was revolutionary. Now, the Reformation, as we all know, split the once universal Catholic world into quite broadly two divisions, Catholics and Protestants, but it's so much more than that as we come across different denominations. But what does it mean in the context of world history? Well, if you look at the revolutionary implications of the Reformation, then we go beyond the religious origins of the Reformation. When you look at the historical origins, you're going to see that it has both a political and a personal dimension to it. When you look at who effects these changes and who pushes these changes into law, then you find that the state and the individual are both involved here. And the old state-church controversy that existed in pre-Renaissance Europe, the state and the church were always competing for authority over the populace. That state-church controversy is going to take a whole different turn here. When you look at political factors, also keep in mind that these political factors are interwoven with economic factors. And the split in the church was not just because of personal disagreements between the Pope and individual thinkers, but it's also a reflection of why this argument takes place initially, which is what it means politically and economically in terms of taxes, who collects the revenue, who controls the property, where do boundaries lie. So these are factors that need to be taken into consideration when you look at the historical origins of the Protestant Reformation. As we know, one of the main factors behind the Reformation was the sale of indulgences. The church was accused of a lot of different levels of corruption, and we're by no means suggesting that every pope and every official in the entire clerical hierarchy was corrupt, but there were enough instances that made the people wary of where the church was going and where church officials in particular were heading. And this was because of what we talked about briefly, the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences, if you recall, was a system that was introduced by the clerical hierarchy where people had to make a certain contribution and they were technically absolved from sin. Absenteeism was another problem that the church was accused of, and absenteeism meant very specifically that one church official was in charge of more than one office. And you'd have, for example, the Bishop of Milan, who could hold office in, say, Naples. And if you look at the distance between Milan and Naples, you know that they're not going to be able to be in both cities at once. And so one congregation is being deprived, clearly. A lot of accusations about corruption, moral corruption, about holding office but really not performing their duties, sometimes being incapable of performing such duties because they were spouting litany, they were not really well versed in Latin, And who would know the difference? The common people didn't know Latin, and so whatever they were told was what they believed to be the truth. And if they were cited chapter and verse in the Bible, again, there was no way to prove that the priests, the entire clerical hierarchy, wasn't really aware of what was the real content of these the scriptures. So the movement began. It's not really something that just takes place in the 16th century. There have been earlier instances where the corruption charges have been leveled and people have questioned the authority of the church and the authority of particular individuals within the church. The immediate causes of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation under Luther, are analyzed to be the last instance of the sale of indulgences, as it were, which was the contribution that was demanded for the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And Luther actually raised that point in the document that he pinned on the door of the church at Wittenberg. Luther was a monk, but he's also a theologian who taught university courses, and he taught at the University of Wittenberg, and there on the door of the Church of Wittenberg he pinned his 95 theses, which were different charges that were leveled against the church and the different kinds of wrongdoing that he listed on that document included this demand for money to repair the Basilica of St. Peter's, the dome and the Basilica of St. Peter's. It was also translated in Germany. I'm sorry, it was also written in the German language, and so clearly a larger number of people had the ability to understand what the document was all about, rather than being written in Latin. And here Luther argued, among other things, that you really didn't have any guarantees that one could be absolved of all their sins just because the priests said so. And ultimately, he questioned even the whole role of the clerical hierarchy, arguing that it's an interpersonal relationship between man and God. His notion was that of justification by faith, that it's by faith alone that people will reach salvation, and it's faith and God. It's really got nothing to do with the priests or the Pope or any member of the clerical hierarchy, really. When this document became widely popular, it really voiced centuries of complaint, and the average German peasant could relate to it, because the average German peasant was already burdened with taxes and had to make so many contributions that they were barely able to make 2 meals a day, let alone make another contribution for the reconstruction of the church in Rome, a church that they would never see in their lifetime. So it resonated with the people, as it did with members of the political elite, with kings and dukes and princes. Germany, there was really no Germany. The German states were run by different kinds of authority figures, and all of these authority figures, mostly in the north, tended to side with Luther for their own reasons, not necessarily out of a great conviction that Luther was addressing all of the wrongs of the church and that's how they felt all along, but because they felt that if they did side with Luther, there was a possibility that they could come out from under the clutches of some of the more powerful Catholic ruling authority figures. At the risk of oversimplifying the issue, I'm going to suggest that amongst these several hundred states, those in the north tended to be more pro-Luther, pro-Protestant in general, and the southern states were more likely to be supportive of Catholicism. So when the Pope found out that the 95 Thesis document was creating such havoc and creating disruption, they ordered the recalling of that document, and Luther refused to recant. Luther was excommunicated. He was called before an imperial diet at Worms, where several of the Catholic monarchs from Portugal, from Spain, the Austrian ruler who was also the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, they all joined together in a reprimand of Luther and a demand that he withdraw his statements. And of course that did not happen. Luther's refusal led to his excommunication, as we just mentioned, and then he was living in exile. It is here in exile that he translated the Bible in German, and again it had a wide circulation. The dispute was no longer just a theoretical argument, it was not just confined to intellectuals. It had much wider following, again, because politically a lot of the authority figures stood to gain from the division within the old United Catholic world. Mostly, again, the North German states, the Scandinavian states, tended to be a part of this one united group, a group of protesters. We have, for example, the Schmalkaldic League that we have halfway through the section under Roman numeral 10, and they would actually meet in battlegrounds. Their frontal combats, hand-to-hand fighting that the continent of Europe witnessed, the Catholics versus the Protestants. And the Catholic world had a lot more by way of financial resources, because they had a lot of the powerful Catholic monarchs providing arms and ammunition. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, considered it his mission to restore the unity of the Catholic world, the Catholic Church, and ultimately a tentative peace was reached in the mid-16th century, the Peace of Augsburg, where theoretically the German princes now had the right to choose the faith of that particular geographical area. Now the average folk didn't have such freedom. The people within that state merely followed the preference of the leader. But theoretically and technically it meant that an individual could pursue, at least individual leaders could pursue a different line, a different autonomous path. When this idea circulated widely, it would depend on how much of a following certain individuals would acquire. And so not only Luther found a great following, those who believed in this notion of justification by faith, but there were also followers of teachers like Calvin. Calvin, who was the architect of the phrase, the doctrine of predestination, and followers of Calvin, Calvinists. Incidentally, your text kind of throws at you the term Huguenots. Huguenots in terms of what's happening in France. Huguenots are French Calvinists, French followers of John Calvin. And so with Calvin comes this other notion. He too argues that there is no such thing as a sale of indulgence which can buy you um, salvation, or which will absolve you from sins, but that it is already determined, in fact predetermined by God. And so from there you get the doctrine of predestination. You're destined to be saved or not, and that's already been determined. So whether or not a member of a clerical hierarchy takes a contribution from you and tells you that you will be saved, that's immaterial. From Calvinists we move on to Anabaptists. Now Anabaptists are against baptism at birth. They're not really anti-baptism, but they're against baptism at birth, because they argue that logically at birth people really don't know enough, cannot possibly know enough to make that conscious decision. So they really should wait until they're adults. They recommend 18 and above, where they consciously make a decision to be baptized, and that's how you get the name Anabaptist. You don't really hear of Anabaptists today, and that's because they were persecuted, both ironically by the Catholic world, as well as even in the protest movements by some of the rulers, because Anabaptists also were very progressive in their thinking. They talked about women's rights, and they talked about not so much the 1% as the rich, but the whole idea of uneven distribution of wealth. And they were precursors to 19th century early socialist thought. So they were very unpopular with political authority figures, whether they were of the Catholic persuasion or otherwise. And then you have Anglicans. Anglicans are protesters in England, and this is where the political and the religious and the economic factors behind the rise of the Reformation become clouded, because with the Anglicans, at least the origin of it, it was more a personal issue. For a lot of you, the name Henry VIII is not an unfamiliar one. Henry VIII was the last of the Tudor rulers, who obviously had a penchant for marriage, as it were. Fair number of wives that he accumulated, most of whom he disposed of. The very first one, Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess, was actually his brother's widow, and so he got a special dispensation from the Pope to marry her, and then 19 years later realized that she was not able to give him the heir, and so he would request another dispensation from the Pope to nullify the marriage, declare it null and void, because after all he was living in sin. He had married his brother's widow, something that dawned on him about 2 decades later. And of course the Pope was not going to negate his own dispensation. Plus the Catholic world did not grant divorces. So Henry VIII realized that the only way he could get his wish, and his wish was to marry Anne Boleyn, was to separate himself from the church. And so it was more a personal issue that really created the breach and the breakaway of England from the Catholic world. Financially, it did pay off quite a bit, because Henry VIII had the astute financial acumen to figure out that the church owned enormous acreages. And this land not only was now appropriated, the monasteries, for example, were in generally remoter areas and harder to control, but had plenty of land on which a lot of things could be grown. And so this was extra agricultural land for the state. There were also the wineries that the state appropriated for an additional income. And so all in all, it paid off. It was a good financial move, not just a personal victory that the English Church separated from the Catholic world. And the Anglican Church emerged. Not that there was much difference in the way service was performed or in the practice of religion was carried out to the common people, but the Anglicans were now a breakaway group, a protest group, and therefore under the Protestants. So all this while that the protest movements are launched and all the criticism is being leveled against the church about immorality of individual clerics, of illiteracy, of absenteeism. The church is not sitting quietly and absorbing all this information and doing nothing. There is a movement within the church to change things, to improve conditions. So oftentimes it's referred to as the Counter-Reformation. Now, counter suggests it is a response to the original Reformation. And it is that, but it's also much more. And it predates the actual response to Luther's Reformation. So I like to call it the Catholic/Counter-Reformation because the antecedents, the origins, predate Luther. And with its pre-Lutheran roots, you find that individual popes have taken it upon themselves to insist on a more scholarly clergy, on reforms within their own individual churches. The most sustained of these efforts come from Paul III, and he actually summons a council of Trent, which meets intermittently for a good 2-decade period. And there the agreement to look into corruption charges more carefully results in very definitive church measures where there are reforms that are carried out from within the Catholic world. There are educational centers or seminaries so that the clergy is more well versed in the scriptures. There is so much discussion about what is accepted and what is not accepted as a list of texts, and so that's also determined by these the frequent meetings that the Council of Trent holds. There are individuals who emerge who take up, sometimes single-handedly and sometimes with their fellow like-minded scholars and priests, the work of actively reinstating those that had strayed from the church and introducing an element of scholarship, an element of almost militant faith within the church. A group emerges that we now recognize as the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. It was under Ignatius Loyola, and Ignatius Loyola had a military background, and he was actually recovering from battle wounds when he had this vision that he had a mission to perform, and that mission led him to create this group known as the Society of Jesus, where they took it upon themselves to bring back those who had strayed from the fold, as it were, not only in Europe, but now they were actually going overseas to spread the gospel, the good word, as it were. That accounts for the presence of Francis Xavier in Japan, who had phenomenal success. He had about a 20, 30-year period in which there were more than 300 to 400,000 conversions. That's the most generous record. Now, the most ungenerous figures would tell you it's about 200,000, but even that is an extraordinary number of conversions that took place in the 16th century. Matteo Ricci was also another Jesuit priest who traveled all the way to China, and Ricci didn't have as phenomenal a success as Francis Xavier, but for a good 300-year period, the number approximately is about 200,000. So conversion figures were quite remarkable in the Catholic/Counter-Reformation period. Alfred de Nobili went to India, Jacques Marquette to the Americas, and there too the numbers, even though they were not as remarkable as Japan and China, the conversion rate was quite remarkable. The joint legacy of both the Reformation as well as the Catholic/Counter-Reformation, well, clearly there is disagreement over doctrine, and there is initial non-acceptance, both from the Catholic side as well as the Protestant side of the Protestants. And of course, where numerous denominations emerge, there is not always an amicable interaction between and amongst these various denominations, but gradually there is greater acceptance, at least the notion that these divisions are here to stay. There is also a promotion of greater literacy, because if you have to argue which denomination has a better justification or a better explanation, you really must know or be familiar with the texts, and to do that, you would obviously have to acquire at least literacy, actually beyond literacy, actual knowledge of what the contents are of these major canons that you're debating and analyzing. There's also the perpetuation of the traditional gender role. Aside from the Anabaptists, really there's no recognition that the status of women has to be the same as that of men. Not yet. We're going to find that by the 17th century there is some questioning of that status, but not prior to that. Some element of choice and individualism when it comes to the choosing of partners in marriage. Otherwise, prior to that, you'd see that it was a family decision. Most importantly, the whole notion of individual rulers having full control over their territory, and the churches really becoming a part of that territorial border, rather than having this distant authority in Rome as the universal spiritual head, as the head of the Catholic world, and even though he was the universal spiritual head, to keep that distance so that the monarchs were all powerful within their own domain. Brings us to Roman numeral 11, which is an analysis of the new monarchy concept. Well, there's not much new about the concept of monarchy. It's the same old, but a monarchy which is new in the sense of a newfound notion of authority. Their source of support, unlike monarchy of the past, where they're really dependent upon other aristocrats. So a monarch emerges out of a family from amongst the aristocrats, and they're constantly looking over their shoulder for, afraid of who's going to take over power, usurp their throne, whether it's from their own family or another rival aristocratic family. And so it's always good to have that counterbalanced by another source of support. And in this particular period, we see that support coming from a new class, and this is the newly rich, the bourgeoisie. The term bourgeoisie, for those of you who've had, again, History 105 or just familiar with the etymology of the word, you probably know where it originated. It's a French word, bourgeoisie, the middle class, but the origin is from the Latin word burgus, and burgus was a term that meant an area that was enclosed by a wall. So those who lived within an area enclosed by a wall were the bourgeoisie. Why would they need a wall? They would need a wall for protection. That protection was from the days of the collapse of the Roman Empire, from Germanic invaders, from marauders, for people who came within their territory and took over their resources. And these were then the inhabitants of an area outside the old agrarian setting, which was run by kings. Kings and queens had the wealth, so they had the wealth to retain armies, and the armies then protected the average citizens. So the average citizens were not living under the protection of a king or a monarchy, but in an urban area. Who would protect them? Well, that's when they needed the arms and ammunition of the soldier force, but a wall would give them protection, the boundary. And the newly rich, the merchants who would escape from the old agrarian lands. Remember how they saved up money, and the average peasant, when they had enough of a nest egg, could actually relocate because there was no opportunity to climb the social ladder in an agrarian system. So the old peasant, who has now become the merchant, and from among the merchants, those who are the richer merchants, assume power in the urban areas, and they then can become the counterpoise to the old aristocracy. And the new monarchy realizes that yes, the agrarian economy is in danger, but there is a new source of wealth from the merchants, and maybe the merchants will have enough wealth that they've accumulated to buy new arms and ammunition, and they can provide protection for the state as well as additional income by way of taxes. And so the bourgeoisie, with its new technology that it can procure, arms and ammunition that it can procure, provides sources of support. And not only do they have the actual physical support of a new class, the new monarchy now has a new ideology, a new rationale that has emerged from the days of the Renaissance to justify their holding on to power, by fair means or foul. And that justification comes in the form of Machiavelli's The Prince, which you're probably all familiar with or have been subjected to at some point or the other if you've taken a poli-sci class. And some of the phrases that you probably remember in association with Machiavelli are the end justifies the means, and the end, the goal, being the acquisition and retention of power. Anything that justifies the acquisition and retention of power is going to be approved by the new monarchy. So the new monarchy has a new twist to the old concept of monarchy, but they're very sure that they want to hold on to all aspects of power. Some examples of new monarchy: Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Prince Henry the Navigator from Portugal, Francis I from France, and Henry II. That's a typo, that should be Henry VII of England. Your handout says Henry II. Henry II was from the medieval period. Probably remember him from the time of Becket and Canterbury Tales, but that's not him. It's Henry VII of England. And you'll notice that they come from different persuasions. Some are even Catholic, so you may wonder how that fits into the Protestant Reformation logic or rationale of independent monarchs trying to retain power independently within their territory. Well, here, for example, Ferdinand and Isabella, devout rulers, so is Prince Henry the Navigator, but they are going to, in the name of the church, also acquire power and position within their territory, or in the name of the church, conduct voyages and missions, but they're not really sacrificing their political power to any other authority. There is a clear separation between the acceptance of the universal spiritual headship of the Pope and their personal penchant for power within their own territory as authoritative figures in their own countries. Where do we go from here? We are now going to Roman numeral 12. The new economy is actually connected with the new monarchy as it is with the Renaissance and the Reformation, because it's ultimately a product of all of the above. There is a shift from the rural to the urban, from a focus on an agrarian economy to a commercial economy, and that commerce has expanded beyond the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, particularly from the days of the Italian middlemen, the merchants, who were no longer able to be the middlemen in terms of the exchange of goods during the last days of the Italian Renaissance. As we talked about, the French invasion of the Italian peninsula kind of put a stop to that. Western Europe actually remained relatively free from invasion. We've talked about the Catholic Protestant fights and counterfights, but there is no real major invasion of an outside force that's taken over the continent of Europe, particularly Western Europe. And so there's relative stability. I'm not going to say peace, but relative stability in the western sections of Europe. There's a rise in agricultural production. There's also simultaneous growth of commerce in cities. The excess produce is being exchanged for other goods that are not available or germane to an area. And so there's a proliferation of trade. And with this notion of expanding horizons, where an individual with a Renaissance mindset feels that he can achieve his true potential, and that achievement of true potential can take him outside of his confines, his known horizons elsewhere, it means that the growth of commerce can expand beyond the known boundaries and expand in terms of international trade. How is that going to be possible? How are they going to venture so many thousands of miles away from their known territorial bases? Well, that's where naval technology, development of finer or more advanced arms and ammunition comes in handy. And now they've got modes of transportation that will take them first across the Atlantic, then across the Pacific. They've got cannons on board. They can shoot at a greater distance, and so they're in a position to take over large continents, just a handful of people. Where did they get the wherewithal, the money to fund all of this? Well, from the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the same class of people that has sponsored the Renaissance. They are settled in urban areas. They're the ones who are supporting the new types of monarchy. the Isabellas and the Ferdinands, who then fall back on the bourgeoisie for the capital that not only provides them with new arms and ammunition and technology and the support and a counterpoise against the old aristocracy, but also the wherewithal to buy ships, to buy cannons, to go clear across the ocean in search of new land and thereafter new wealth. There's also the development of banking, and ventures are now protected because individuals are not conducting these journeys on their own. There is the birth of what in the future would be the multinational, the joint stock company. As the name itself suggests, people jointly hold stock, which means that a business is no longer confined within just one household. They can be multiple generations, 3 generations investing in that company, friends and neighbors, the entire town or village, or it could be really multinational in the sense that you could have a Beauvais tapestry worker, a Belgian glassmaker, or a Copenhagen fisherman venturing into the purchase of a boat that's probably going to set sail from Lisbon, Portugal. Okay, beginnings of globalization then, and the rise of capitalism. That brings us to Roman numeral 13, which is the analysis of the explorations. The explorations obviously are funded by the bourgeoisie, the Columbuses, the Balboas, the De Sotos, the Magellans of the world would be nowhere without the funding from the bourgeoisie. These are individuals who didn't come laden with money and did not sail the ocean blue on their own with their own funds, but they had the resources of the bourgeoisie, and they had the backing, the licenses, the charters, the sanction, the approval of the monarchs, the new monarchy. Again, it's not the Ferdinands and the Isabellas who are also the people who are conducting these ventures. They get the credit for it, but they're seldom the financiers of these explorations. So where do they go? Well, they go across the Atlantic, they go across the Pacific. Who takes the lead? The Portuguese and the Spanish in the 15th, 16th centuries, the Dutch in the 17th century, the English and the French in the 18th century. What are their motives? The easiest way to remember would be the G factors: God, gold, and glory, not necessarily in that order. In fact, God sometimes plays a secondary role as a convenient strategy to adapt, even though gold is the primary motive, or glory, just an individual trying to acquire fame, or a monarch trying to establish his supremacy over neighboring monarchs. And so the God, gold, and glory factors will motivate countries and country-sponsored explorations to various continents. When you look at the earliest years, and you see Portugal and Spain taking the role of leadership, take a look at the map. At this point, your atlases, if you have purchased them, would come in handy, or just a simple Google search will take you to the 15th century world of explorations. You're going to see by the mid-15th century they have already rounded the Cape Verde area, which is to the northwest in Africa. And they're pretty much hugging the coast at this point because they're so afraid of boats capsizing. They're not really familiar with the winds and waters of the mid-Atlantic. And so the journeys take infinitely longer, but they're playing it safe. And so they're incredibly long voyages, and you'd wonder why they would take these long voyages and not just go across land. After all, that's been done 3 centuries ago by the Marco Polo, the Polo family. But gone were the days of the Mongols, where there was safe protection provided across these land journeys. And then by the time we come to the 15th century, mid-15th century, we've already talked about why land travel was further impossible because of the Ottoman Turkish takeover of the Black Sea and areas east of the Black Sea. So now they have to take the long circuitous route where if they wanted to go to Asia, they'd have to go through the west coast of Africa, then go further south, reach the Cape of Good Hope, then round the Cape of Good Hope and go further east to the Arabian Sea, through the Indian Ocean, into South and Southeast Asia. So Bartholomew Diaz around the Cape of Good Hope around the late 15th century. Even later than that, you have Vasco da Gama going the same route, but going further east and reaching the west coast of India. They're not the only ones who have traveled in this area, as we've talked about the Ming Chinese missions, the Arab merchants who are well versed in the area. Well, the Arab merchants actually conduct a blockade of the Red Sea, but they're more focused in general. The Islamic world is more focused on an insular revival, almost a renaissance of their own. The Chinese missions stopped just as abruptly as they began. Again, people speculate the reason why. It could be that they were fearful of eunuch revolution in the court, or that the Chinese emperors were truly skeptical about coming into contact with the foreign world. Whatever the reason, the missions had stopped by the mid-15th century, and so the Portuguese and the Spaniards really had no competition in terms of anyone else taking over the global trade. And so now we have the first Governor General from Portugal, Albuquerque, who sets up base in the northwest of India with Goa as the political headquarters. And this is the beginnings of empire building. It's not just going to be simple trade, a few adventurous souls looking for some exotic products, but they're going to come back fairly regularly, and they find that going back and forth is more expensive, so why not set up an infrastructure? Or they have to go back probably less often, or there is more of a possibility to stay on and conduct trade, and that's where they not only have a political headquarters in Goa, but they also have further east in Southeast Asia and the Malay Peninsula an economic headquarters in Malacca. And again, if you look at the map, if they go further east, that will take them from Southeast Asia to East Asia to China, Canton. Canton becomes the base from where people like Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit explorer that we had mentioned, Jesuit missionary that we had mentioned before, will start his proselytizing missions. And from Canton to Macau, we have the actual first establishment of a Portuguese enclave, initially without the permission of the Chinese authorities, but thereafter it's almost a fait accompli. They've already set up base, and the Chinese Ming authorities were not able to throw the Portuguese out. So from trade to missionary activities, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes one supporting the other, but both types of ventures in pursuit of God and gold are conducted by the late 1500s. Spain, not to be left behind. Again, if you take a look at the map in Europe, you're going to find that Spain has obviously a much larger piece of territory in the continent of Europe, and Portugal is flanked by this giant Spain on its east. And if Portugal wanted to expand, the only direction it could go would be west. It's about to explain Portugal's motive. Portugal and Spain, both in the days of the Reconquista, as we talked about before, they have just witnessed their victory in several of these clashes of culture. The first clash of cultures was the Battle of Tours in the 8th century, when the first wave of Islamic expansion was halted by Charles Martel. In subsequent clashes of culture through the years of the Crusades, and the final one in the 15th century were the Moors, quote-unquote, the Moors, the Muslim powers in the south of Spain, were defeated. It's in the aftermath of this recent Reconquista mentality and victory that Spain and Portugal wanted to literally conquer the world. And so Spain would go in the direction of the Americas. I've got the missions of Columbus in 1492, 93, 98. First in Cuba and Hispaniola, through the Caribbean, where he was convinced that he'd reach the shores of India, hence the name Indios for the local population. Not to be left far behind, England in the late 15th century, Cabot and the landing in what would, again, not to be very original, be in New England. In the 1500s, early 16th century, they're going to South America with Cable and Vespucci. Early 16th century, the missions of Cortez and Pizarro take them to the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. So we've got both North and South America now that are quote-unquote being discovered. Very unfortunate word, because these continents existed for the longest of times. They were not really discovered, they were now just being found by European explorers. So if you draw an imaginary line down the Atlantic, north to south, then predominantly west of that imaginary line you'd find is a Spanish hemisphere, barring Brazil, which remained a Portuguese colony. And again, if you take a look at the map, a tiny little country like Portugal taking a huge substantial chunk of South American territory like Brazil, it seems inexplicable. But again, in the 15th, 16th centuries, Portugal had a distinct advantage. Portugal and Spain both had a distinct advantage over these huge land masses that they were taking in the name of their ruler or in the name of God, because they had superior technology and arms and ammunition, and the indigenous population in the areas that they were taking over were not able to provide a resistance, united or otherwise, for a variety of reasons. So if you look at that Treaty of Tordesillas, the 1494, where it was drawn up by the Pope, because this is strictly in the era of the Catholic/Counter-Reformation, where they're trying to regain membership of the Catholic world from not only Europe, people in Europe who had left the Catholic world and they're trying to get them back, but also getting new recruits in Asia and Africa and the Latin American world. And so if Portugal and Spain tried to compete with one another, and they tried to really fight one with the other about who is going to take over what area, that might jeopardize the mission of the Catholic/Counter-Reformation. So the Pope, I believe it was Alexander the Sixth. I'm not 100% sure. Let's look it up just to make sure that we're not giving you the wrong Pope's name here. But the Treaty of Tordesillas, the treaty itself, is really an important treaty to remember, because this is a mediation by the Pope so that Spain and Portugal don't fritter away their energies fighting with one another, but they both individually carry out their purpose, and their main purpose, as far as the Pope is concerned, was to get as many recruits as possible back to the Catholic world and gain more recruits from the New World, as it were. So that's the end of our discussion on the factors behind modernization. Whether or not you agree with the term modernization, there are certain factors which are leading to an enormous amount of change in Europe, in the continent of Europe. And these changes made it possible for certain individuals to go across boundaries beyond their known world into a completely different area of the world. And of course, the world, as a result of that, shrinks and becomes more interconnected. And sometimes they really don't have a choice in the matter, and they become interconnected whether or not they want to be interconnected. But certain conditions in Europe are actually promoting activities like the explorations, and there's a whole range of social economic factors that are interwoven that we just talked about: the rise of capitalism, the rise of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, a type of monarchy that is in support of this new development, and the mindset that's promoted, focus on individualism and individual interpretations, and individual trying to realize his full potential through the mindset of the Renaissance and the Reformation. So it's not necessarily just by default that Europe is taking the role of leadership in the world of explorations, even though the Ming Dynasty in China, as we have found out, had the wherewithal, as did the Arab world, and both had familiarity with the winds and waters of the Pacific, certainly, the Pacific region. So they could have at some point superseded the Portuguese or the Spanish, at least as far as Asia and Africa were concerned, and yet they didn't. And so we look for not just the reasons by default that Europe took the lead in the world of explorations, but what factors actually contributed towards this leadership. Hopefully this sets the background for the 17th, 18th centuries and how European explorations will lead to other developments that will affect the indigenous population of a variety of continents. In fact, Asia, Africa, Latin America will all be affected by the presence of these first the Portuguese and the Spanish, thereafter the Dutch, thereafter the English and the French. All right, I guess we will resume with the next bit in the coming weeks.